The Global Energy Leaders Podcast, episode 65.
Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Welcome to another edition of the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Ray. So good to have you. And today, this, I've got to say, folks, has been my favorite interview that we've done so far. Really enjoyed this discussion with Ellen Wald. She is so knowledgeable. She's got a book coming out about Saudi Aramco next year. And so she is really on top of things. And so I think you are going to enjoy this discussion. And this is one of these discussions that, you know what, I don't ask this often, but share it with your friends and get their feedback. We'd love to hear from them on what they think about it. So without further ado, I sat down with Dr. Ellen Wald the other day, and here is what she had to say. Well, Dr. Wald, thank you so much for coming on today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Okay, well, we have talked about OPEC a lot on this show, but you are kind of a good thing to have you on because you are, I've seen on Twitter, you talk about it, you're writing a book about Saudi Aramco, and so you have been following this OPEC stuff, I'm sure, pretty extensively for the past couple of years.
Yeah, OPEC is a big issue today. Not that it wasn't a big issue in the past, but it's really a big issue today. And there's all sorts of intrigue and, you know, every word and analyzing what every word means. So it's really an exciting time to be looking at OPEC and the major players there.
Okay, so I just have to ask, and if it's a spoiler alert for the book, say you won't answer, but is the IPO actually going to go? I have read some people who speculate that maybe this won't happen because of the impact on the other OPEC nations.
You know, that's a good question. And every indication that I've gotten is that the IPO is going. I think the big question isn't if it's going to happen, but when it's going to happen and where, what markets and when will it happen. But everything seems to be on its way and pointing towards a definite yes.
Okay, so let's kind of take a step back. We've kind of talked about it, but I want to make sure that for the listeners who may be new to the show and haven't heard us, we're talking about Saudi Aramco. Let's just set the table there. Who owns Saudi Aramco? Where is it located? And why are they even considering going through an IPO? And for those who may not follow along with what IPOs actually are, what does an IPO actually do, and what is the end result of that?
So those are all really good questions. So Saudi Aramco is the national oil company of Saudi Arabia. And right now, it is a Saudi company. Didn't used to always be a Saudi company. In fact, when it was started, it was an American company. It was just called Aramco, and it was owned by four American oil companies, Exxon, Chevron, Texaco, and Mobil. And they owned it in 30-30-30-10 distribution of shares. And they also took oil in that percentage from Aramco as well. So for many years, it was an American company. It was in Saudi Arabia. It was headquartered in Dhahran. I believe initially headquartered in San Francisco, but they moved their headquarters to Dhahran, which is in Saudi Arabia. And then starting in the 1970s, the Saudis began to purchase shares in the company. They first negotiated that they would buy 25% of the company, which they did. We don't know how much they paid for it. That information is confidential, has remained confidential. I've asked about it, but no one wants to say just yet. But
hold on, you have to go touch the orb, I think, to get that kind of information.
Yeah, exactly. That might be contained there. But then they went and bought. They increased their share to 60% later in the 70s, and then finally negotiated and in 1980 bought out the entire company from the Americans, and in 1988 converted to a fully Saudi company, which is owned by, because the Saudi government is a monarchy, it is owned by the king, who today is King Salman. So he is the shareholder of the company, but the company is run separate from the government. It's not a division of the government. It's run by Aramco. Aramco has its own CEO, has its own board of directors. There is a lot of, interaction between the company and the government. They have a petroleum council that they interact with, but the company is kind of like an island unto itself, and it's in Dhahran, and it runs itself. When we talk about an IPO, we're talking about an initial public offering. So Aramco is a private company owned by the Saudi government. And but when they're thinking about doing this IPO, so they have said they want to offer as an initial offering 5% of the company. We don't know yet. We don't have information about what kind of offering they're going to give, what kind of shares, and how that's going to work just yet. But people suspect that the initial valuation of the entire company may be between $1 and $2 trillion, which would make it probably the largest IPO of all time. Now, they're only going to IPO 5% of that. So, they'll be actually taking in a smaller amount of money, but it would value the entire company at an extremely large number.
Yeah, 1 to 2 trillion is almost global energy media big. It's not quite that big. If we were to IPO, so I guess we won't IPO till they get theirs done, so we don't want to outshine them. But it's one of the things I learned. I met some guys from Saudi Aramco a few years back, and I didn't realize at the time. It's just you don't really cross their paths a lot. Obviously, over here in the States, but they had like 55,000 employees, and they were describing what it was like to work there, and they described it like it's a city, and you said I think an island. It's kind of like they go to work and everything they need was there, and you hear about that with Google maybe or Apple now, but it's really like its own sub nation almost.
Oh yeah, that's exactly how I've seen it described. And not only that, but I've heard it described like that even from people who lived there, in the 1950s and the 1960s, when it really was like an oasis in the desert. I mean, and it was like an American oasis in the desert. They had everything they needed there. They had a swimming pool and tennis courts and a movie theater and their own commissary and their own school. It was really like an entire oasis. And then they had other, facilities at other places. The big one was in Dhahran, but then they had people lived in Abqaiq and in some other places. But it was very much run kind of unto itself. And in the book, I tell some of the interesting stories that happened, in the early days of Aramco and some of the relations between local leaders, for example, who kind of one of the local governor of the area, he was a very stern guy. And he really took it upon himself to make sure that the Americans weren't bothered by any of the other people there. And he was very strong and kind of disciplined that way.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have a neighbor, her husband who has passed away now, but she and her husband that lived in the kind of this area in Ramco back before, I guess it was the early 90s. And so just kind of hearing some of her stories and traveling the world has been interesting. But one more question about Aramco, and I want to talk about a little bit more broader OPEC, is I heard there's some talk that they may not include some or all of their strategic reserves in their IPO. Can you comment on that for us?
Yeah, so it's an interesting situation because the way that Aramco sees it and the Saudis see it is they see that the reserves are owned by the government. And so Aramco doesn't actually own the reserves, but Aramco has the exclusive right to develop those reserves. So the kingdom owns it, and then they basically have leased it exclusively to Aramco. So anything that Aramco finds, they get to develop. So there's kind of a slight, it's kind of a technicality. They don't own it, but nobody else is going to be allowed to use it anyway. And we don't really know very much about the reserves. Aramco said in its most recent annual review that they have 260.8 billion barrels of oil, and that they also discovered 2 new oil fields in 2016. So, they're still discovering oil. They've got massive, massive oil fields. We don't know a whole lot about those oil fields, but to give you a kind of comparison, Aramco's or Saudi Arabia's oil reserves are, I'll tell you, Exxon, for example, has about 1/13 of the oil reserves that Saudi Aramco has. So we're talking huge amount of oil.
Wow, that's a pretty staggering number to put it in perspective when you think of how large Exxon is and 1/13 of that. Is there some fear from the Saudis that going an IPO would open them up? You mentioned a minute ago, kind of set the question a little better here, is that they bought this, and one of the things, if you look into like the the top richest people in the world list, the Saudis are on there, but as I understand it, no one really knows how much money they have because of the kind of some of the stuff you described already. Is there some fear from inside the government that opening up their books through the IPO might give away more than they want to give out and more information they've given out historically?
I think that that is a fear on the part of definitely of a lot of people, and I've had people say that to me, how we can't let other people know that this is our, this is our crown jewel, this is our treasure. But I think that the idea, at least on the part of those who are in favor of the IPO, is that maybe it's time, or this is not, keeping it secret is not necessarily where the value lies. I mean, right now, they're a private company and it's their right to keep these things closely held. And, they will have to make certain information public when they do have their IPO. What information exactly becomes public will depend on where they IPO, which is a subject of great speculation. What markets are they going to list? They said they want to list on the Saudi stock market, but that's only one listing, and they're also going to list on a Western market, maybe New York, maybe London. And the rules for disclosures are slightly different. I also think that they may still be considering listing as well on an Asian market.
Interesting, interesting. So let's kind of step back and let's talk about OPEC in general. I know late last year, early this year, there were some folks, and myself included, were talking about OPEC might, just kind of disband. This might be the end of them. Not in 2017, but over by 2020, 2025, we might see it kind of fall apart. I've seen some of those projections that say, well, you know what, it might not happen. It might, OPEC's kind of banded together. They might be able to make it through this. I'm still thinking that they're going to dismantle for several reasons. One is this IPO. I know there's some talk of, I think it's Kuwait, who's considering going an IPO as well now. Also, if you just kind of look at it, it seems to me that, because the Saudis have so much influence, that what they're doing and what they want to push through their OPEC agenda isn't always good, especially for countries like Nigeria. What are your thoughts on the future of OPEC?
Well, I do think that OPEC is a changing organization, and I've looked at OPEC since its founding. It was founded by a former Saudi oil minister Abdullah Tariki, and also by a former Venezuelan oil minister Juan Perez Alfonso, and they kind of co-founded this group. And when they founded it, the idea behind it was twofold. One was to kind of support oil prices because at the time the countries that were kind of producing oil, or the oil-rich countries, felt like they were being taken advantage of by the oil companies that were either producing their oil or selling it. So they wanted to kind of collectively bargain as a way to pressure them for higher prices, because it was a time when there was an oil glut and the companies were pushing prices down. But there was another purpose, which was also to try to encourage native ownership over over oil resources. And that's definitely something that they took a while. When 1960 they started, and Saudi Arabia didn't really get it until 1980. But that is something that they achieved. And I think OPEC has evolved as an organization over time. It certainly became a much more technical and professional organization, as opposed to one that was much more influenced by political desires and political relationships. Like right now, you see Saudi Arabia and Russia, which is not an OPEC member, cooperating in OPEC,
Right.
and you see Iran cooperating with Saudi Arabia and OPEC, but they don't like each other in all other realms. So I think OPEC has a purpose. I don't think that OPEC can, at this point, do the kind of thing that it did in 1973, which was what everyone remembers, this oil shocks. But there have been times in OPEC's history when it couldn't do that. In the 80s, it wasn't able to support prices. So I don't think OPEC is dead at all. I don't think it's going down. I think it will continue to be an organization. I think that the way that it works and the influence it has over the market kind of waxes and wanes. And that right now we're in a period where it has less influence. But one of the things I've always learned about the oil market is never say never, because things could change really quickly.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely, never say never. And I think from my standpoint, is you step back and you look at kind of the global economy, and you look at what's going on with developing nations and how these developing nations are going to come onto the grid. So you have large portions of countries where there's not power, not access to power, and you see that microgrid technology is going out there and trying to power them. Those countries are going to have in my opinion, a big question to answer over the next 2-3 decades. Is how does the government, because the government owns these utility companies, how does the government still provide power when you have villages and towns and cities who are growing up on solar power, and they haven't used the traditional mechanism. On top of that, if you look at what's going on in Mexico with their energy reform, we're still very early on, but they have opened the door for entrepreneurs and people to come in. And now you see with Aramco, this potential IPO is going on. It seems like capitalism on some level is influencing these different nations from different aspects. So two or three different aspects I laid out right there. And I'm just curious to see, as you mentioned, there's non-OPEC nations working with OPEC nations, and it just seems the more cross borders we get, especially with oil and gas, where we can really reach across borders. I'm just curious if people are going to sit back and go, you know what, large organizations that kind of, they're not always going to have my best interests at heart. I'd like to go out and make a deal for myself. And so I don't know. I'm not as optimistic as you are, but I do see your point.
Yeah, and Mexico is such a good example of this. And I definitely think that you're seeing kind of the preeminence of capitalism reign, essentially. Like everyone's going out and figuring out what's best for themselves. And I think that we saw that really clearly in 2014 when the Saudis showed up at OPEC and nobody wanted to cut. And Saudi was like, it's not good for us. We're not going to just cut because, you all want us to cut because we've done that before. And it didn't just harm Saudi Arabia, but it really hurt Saudi Aramco. In the 80s, Saudi Arabia was basically like the swing producer and kept cutting and cutting its oil production in order to support oil prices for other countries, and OPEC were overproducing. And Aramco itself had a really hard time. They had to, cut back on their development. And as a company, it wasn't good for them. And basically the idea in 2014 was, we're not doing that again. That's not what we're doing. It's not good for us. So I think that we're definitely seeing the rise of we're not going to make agreements that aren't good for us. If we can get something done that is good for everyone, fine. But we're not going to necessarily agree to something that goes against our interests. And that's one of the things that I think we really have to look at when you're looking at, well, what do you think OPEC's going to do? What do you think the Saudis are going to do, or the Russians are going to do, or the Mexicans are going to do? You have to think, what did they see as in their best interests? And that's a lot of, kind of what I specialize in my consulting. But you got to think about it. Like, what do you think they're going to do? Are the Saudis going to go along with this just to go along with it, or are they going to pursue what's best for them?
No, absolutely. There's it's just one of those things where you could discuss the potential outcomes and the factors for hours on end, and almost feel like you haven't made any progress, but you've made a lot of progress, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So I want to kind of step back here and let's talk about help our listeners think about like this, because I see a lot of headlines in the oil and gas news that say OPEC versus the Permian, and for me, when I see that article, that headline at least, I'm not really it kind of turns me off of the article, because it's like, okay, I don't really see OPEC versus the Permian. It doesn't seem to be like the category errors almost going on there. How should U.S. producers or people in the U.S. think about the Permian and the Bakken and the Eagle Ford as it competes against the OPEC? Is it a versus? Is it two completely separate things? How would you describe those relationships?
I completely agree with you. I do not see it as a war at all. This is not a war. These are two very different types of oil production. And I would just see it as, this is a market and there are competitors and people are competing for customers. And it's not a war. It's not like good versus bad, or, it's not a war. It's a market. This is life. It's an oil market. And one of the things I think we have to understand is OPEC, but particularly Saudi Arabia, which is really the most influential country, OPEC player, they see things in long term. They have the kind of ability, because of their position, because of the company, because of their oil reserves, they see things in the much longer terms than companies in shale production. So whereas a shale producer might be thinking, okay, how do I cover my budget for this quarter? And what's next quarter going to look like? And like, where am I hedged? And, how is this going to, how am I going to make this work? And where am I going to get my next line of credit? Okay, the Saudis are thinking, what do we want to do for 10 years down the line? What do we think it's going to look like in 10 years? And if you think about it like that, if you realize that they're thinking about it in different concerns, and you realize that the Saudis don't really care what happens in the oil market, in 1 week, or
Right.
that's not their priority. And I think then you can understand where they're looking and how they fit into the market together.
No, I think that's a lot of wisdom there, and one of the things I like to point out to people is, you'll see the price start falling. The U.S. production may ramp up, and people are like, "Oh my gosh, why is this going on?" I'm like, "Well, you got to understand, they may have leases that are getting ready to expire. They may have rigs that are committed. There's all these factors that are going on with these shale producers that are not the same for these, these OPEC nations or the Saudis especially. The interest in how they make money, as you mentioned, there's credit lines they've got to pay off. And there's all these unique factors that is, for me, it's just kind of hard just to say, well, it's the Permian versus OPEC when you've got ABC Drilling out here who's got to pay his credit line this month or he goes out of business. And you know what? He may only make $1 a barrel, but he's got to drill. And so I just think the dynamics are just so different. It's kind of hard to compare. And also, I'm a free markets guy, so it's not that I'm anti-U.S. producers on any stretch of the imagination, but I do want the market to compete for supremacy.
I think it makes it it makes it so much fun to watch too, is to see this incredible like US market that is so dynamic and so different because there's so many small producers. And I know that there are fewer than there were before. And that's natural, that's progression of things. But it makes it so interesting, especially in an industry which is largely dominated by major big time players. We have these small companies that are competing and that are drilling, and you have to understand that their motivations are, even if they aren't necessarily making a profit or making a big profit by selling a barrel of oil at whatever the price is today, they've got to sell that oil even if they're not making a profit,
Right.
because they've got to make that money to make their payroll.
Yep.
And so I find it almost amusing when you get someone like Harold Hamm who comes on. He's like, shale producers, we should all slow down our production. Well, they can't do that. They need to produce. And that's what's so interesting and I think exciting about this US market. It's so American.
Yeah, Harold Ham. If you're listening, Mr. Ham, we'd love to have you on the show. Um, I have read some of his comments over the past few years, and I'm stunned by how bad he gets it sometimes. I mean, he sold his hedges at $60 a barrel, and then thinking that the price was going to rebound in 2014, and I mean, newsflash, they didn't. It lost hundreds of millions of dollars of guaranteed prices that he had, and it's just like, I'm not so sure. And he said some stuff since then that it's like, I read the book, the Frackers we had on Gregory Zuckman talking about it, and obviously he did some great things and built a company, and he's probably knows more about the oil business than I ever will. But it's just sometimes you read some quotes from the CEOs, it's like I'm not sure why you're saying this. Maybe you can help me understand where Ham's coming from.
Well, I think that he's saying it because that's what he wants, because that would be good for him and good
Right,
for his
right,
company.
right.
And that's what he sees, but as a good thing for him. And I actually wrote an article about this the first time he said it, and I kind of described it as like they're experiencing this tragedy of the commons, where they all have to keep producing in order to stay alive. And yes, it would certainly be better for Harold Hamm's company if he could get some of them to stop producing, because then they go out of business and he could buy them. So,
Right.
just like everybody else out there, he's acting in his own selfish interest, of course. If he says it too often, he could get, regulators coming after him for trying to collude, because what he's saying is basically illegal.
Right, right. Well, and just to kind of get off the Ham thing for a second, but something you mentioned a minute ago, I wanted to circle back around to is, if you look at, you talked about the little guy competing, and that's the thing about the open market is it does give the chance for the little guy to compete. And so if the little guy can go in there, he can find a strategic spot to lease some land, to go drill. They're going to find a way to do it for cheaper than someone who's maybe a little bit looser with their cash, and so they're going to do it. And then all of a sudden they may buy some new technology or develop some new technology, and then what you'll see is a bigger company will come in and they'll buy that technology. They go, oh wow, we can reduce our costs across the board. And so it's on the flip side though, if a smaller producer is maybe not as prudent with what they're doing, and they're a little bit loose with their cash, they're going to go out of business, and we don't want to see people lose their jobs. That's not what we want. I've had to lay folks off, and it's terrible. I hate that. But from just a purely market standpoint, it's actually what the market needs. You need the people who are out of the market so that more efficient companies can come in and then lower the cost to drill and the break-even price.
Yeah. And one of the other things that I think people need to remember about the shale industry in the United States is that you can't kill it, because the oil will always be there. The issue is really just when is it going to get produced?
Hmm.
And so, I would say, I would venture to say that the Saudis know this. They know that the oil is going to be there. The issue is when and who produces it at what costs and sells it for how much. And so they know that you can't kill it. It's there. It's going to be there. And they've also got shale oil. They've also got unconventional resources that at some point they would probably like to develop. It's just for them, it's not cost effective at this point to even begin to develop those resources.
Right, and I guess one final question is I think that part of the issue, we've kind of touched on it a few times, credit lines, is that these companies go out and get massive credit lines. I'm curious to see how many of the banks, if prices did, for argument's sake, got up to $65, $70 a barrel, what would be the banking stance on lending money to producers? Would they kind of be, oh, I'm a little hesitant to give all this cash that I lost, or would they, be opening credit lines? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I looked at this back, especially when oil prices were like $27 a barrel, really low. And I was thinking about, what's going to be their limit. And what seems to have kind of shaken out is that companies that showed growth got more money, got investors, got more credit, and things like that. So it didn't seem to have much to do with necessarily, how much they were producing or what price point, but how much growth they had. And we definitely saw companies becoming a lot smarter about where they were producing and the costs for producing and things like that. But it does seem like investors are rewarding growth as a measure as opposed to profitability. I do think at some point that there's going to be a time when somebody wants to see some profit and not just growth. And I'm not sure when exactly that is, but I do believe that that will come.
Gotcha, gotcha. Well, we're speaking with Dr. Ellen Wald, who has a book, as you might imagine, on Saudi Aramco called Saudi Inc., coming out in 2018. Is that correct?
Yes, and I think pretty soon we're going to have an Amazon link up to pre-order the book.
Awesome, awesome. And so I just got to ask, we don't have a lot of doctors come on the show, and so I always feel like I got to watch my P's and Q's when we get on the smart folks on. But what made you get into energy I see looks like you went to Boston University and to Princeton. So what brought your focus to energy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I am actually a historian by training. I have a PhD in actually it's American history with a focus in international relations. So how in the world did I get into energy? So when I was an undergraduate, I studied Near Eastern studies, and I kind of continued on that. When I was in graduate school, I studied a couple Middle Eastern languages, even though I was doing American history. And I was really interested in business, economics, and diplomacy, and how government and business interact in kind of the foreign sphere, particularly the Middle East. And so what businesses are, the biggest and the most interesting to study? American businesses going abroad in the Middle East, oil companies. Those are the biggest ones. And so I did my graduate research. My dissertation was about the relationship between government and business in the oil industry in the Middle East. So I looked at Aramco in particular. I also looked at American companies that were involved in Iran, in Iranian oil industry. I looked a little bit at some others as well. And so that's mostly in the 40s and 50s. And so that's how I kind of got into it. And I was in academia for a little while. I taught Middle East history and policy. And then in 2014, when oil prices crashed, when OPEC basically, when the Saudis kind of stood up at that meeting and said, we're not going to cut, and everyone went into a production free for all, and everyone was kind of scrambling, what's going to happen? When are the prices going to go back up? When's OPEC going to change its mind? And I looked at the situation and I said, they're not going to change their minds. They're not going to change their minds for a while. And I wrote some pieces about it. I wrote my first piece about what the Saudi motivation was for doing this, and what their strategic plan was for magazine called Modern Trader. It's a commodities trading magazine. At that point, it was called Futures Magazine. Now it's called Modern Trader. And things kind of went on from there. And, I write about policy. I do some writing about, U.S. energy policy, and write about the Middle East, about geopolitics. And I do consulting work, and I'm writing this book. So I'm kind of doing all sorts of different things in energy. I'm really active on Twitter. So listeners can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Energized Economy, or you can just look up my name, Ellen R. Wald. I write for Forbes and investing.com. And one of the great things, both of those publications are fantastic. One of the neat things about investing.com is that my pieces are translated into a bunch of different languages. So if you are listening from another country and you want to read my pieces in your language, you can hopefully find them there.
Absolutely. Well, we have listeners in, I think, 82 countries. So hopefully it'll be translated into one of their native languages. But of course, if they're listening to the show, I imagine they can speak English on some level. But regardless, and I would like to say that you will be a regular contributor on this podcast as well.
I am really looking forward to it. I had such a great time today.
I did too. I love talking about this stuff. It's so much more fun than doing real work. So no, I had a blast. Thank you so much for coming on. We will link to all of her the Amazon link isn't ready yet, but when the book comes out, we will obviously put a feature piece on the website, and we will link to all the information that we mentioned in the show notes, so you can go check her out and follow her on Twitter. I love watching your tweets about writing. I think I saw one the other day. You finished so many words, and now you're doing this, and then you finish another so many words, and me, I can't write about 200 words. I'm like, okay, I'm done. I get a book idea like once a week. I'm like, I'll write a book, and I'm like, okay, what? I got the title and the chapter breakdown, and I quit. So
I am definitely in the thick of it right now. So that's my summer project is finish the manuscript. So that's definitely what I'm tweeting about now. I tweet about all sorts of things. Come football season, I'll be probably tweeting a bit about football too. So hopefully people don't mind my mild obsession with the New York Giants.
Well, I better not say as long as it's not the Dallas Cowboys, and I know I live in Texas. That's probably heresy, but as long as it's not the Dallas Cowboys, I can tolerate it. So
all right, yeah, I'm definitely not a Cowboys fan. Sorry, Texas.
All right. Well, Dr. Wald, thank you so much for coming on.
All right. Thank you.
Like I said, I really enjoyed that discussion. Probably my favorite interview. It is my favorite interview that I've done so far. It just, sometimes you do an interview and it really flows well, and this was one of them. She has agreed to come back on the show again as a regular contributor, so you will be hearing more from her on a monthly basis. And so appreciate Chris and Michael and all their hard work to getting our contributors lined up. If you're interested in being a contributor for Global Energy Media, let me know. Ryan@globalenergymedia.com. Shoot me an email. Say, hey, I'd love to do some writing, maybe some podcasting, maybe come on as a guest. Let me know. I'd love to hear from you. The Global Energy Leaders podcast is produced by Michael Sims and Chris Prine. Chris Prine also serves as editor for the Global Energy Leaders podcast. Until next time, keep climbing.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders podcast, powered by R Squared Global.